making, and I dare say, a work of organizational psychology. This egregious practice resulting from the Trump administration's zero-tolerance border policy is still impacting lives as the Biden administration works to pick up the pieces, diligently seeking to unite families that were separated and inadequately tracked. With Caitlin's deep journalistic dive, we've been able to gain new insights into how this policy went from an extreme fringe idea to the cornerstone of the Trump administration's immigration policy. She deftly identifies the architects and the enablers, the motivations and the intentions for a policy that was brutish and barbaric at its core. So with all that in mind, I'm really quite honored to share the virtual stage with Caitlin, who is one of our preeminent journalistic voices on immigration. Before joining The Atlantic, Caitlin worked as a reporter for the New York Times, where she broke news about deportation and detention policies and profiled the lives of immigrants. Before that, she was an investigative reporter for NPR and received multiple awards for her work. Caitlin, thank you so very much for joining us. I appreciate that you're making time to continue to unpack what is truly an astonishing story. This is a really important public policy story, but I want to start with the journalism itself, Caitlin. This is a Herculean feat that took you over a year and a half to complete. And I imagine that you went down many divergent rabbit holes with over 150 interviews conducted. Help us to understand the process. What sparked this exploration? What's required in order to support this kind of investigatory journalism, which I truly believe is vital for any healthy democracy? Caitlin, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I think this is a really important venue to have this discussion. And to talk about the process for this story a little bit, at the outset, this was a story that I felt, since 2017 needed to be researched and needed to be written. There were so many things about family separations and zero tolerance that fell completely outside the bounds of what I understood to be normal governing and policy making, setting aside any partisan considerations and really any moral considerations about the idea to separate families. The fact that when reporters asked and when Congress asked the Department of Homeland Security whether this was happening, and for 6 months or more was told that it wasn't, when in fact it was. I mean, that's a huge problem. That's not how our democracy functions, again, regardless of who's in office. So, my boss at The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, and my editor, Scott Stossel, and I all felt the story was really, really important. And really what it took to make it happen was them just telling me to keep going. It's a very, very long story when you really trace the roots of zero tolerance and family separations, as I'm sure we'll get into. You have to go back to 9/11, and they were, generous enough, and I think kind of had the clarity of conviction to determine that the reporting shouldn't stop, based on some arbitrary deadline, that I should just keep going and keep interviewing more and more people until I felt like I'd gotten as close as I could to the bottom of what happened here. In my interviews, they were a lot of times very similar. I would ask people who were involved, whether they were DHS employees, whether they were White House officials, whether they worked for, a sub-grantee of the Health and Human Services Department, which houses children. I asked all these individuals to start at the beginning, tell me what you saw, what you heard, what happened in meetings. And then we did a lot of extensive requests for records to corroborate those stories and pit them up against each other to figure out, what actually happened.
Can we sit in those stories a little longer, Caitlin, before we get into the details of the political and policy questions? I wonder if there's an individual story that lingers for you, given the proximity that you've had to this for years. This didn't just begin for you in the last year and a half. You've been covering immigration, deportations, and this exact crisis since the very beginning.
To be honest with you, Patrick, there are a lot of stories that linger with me, and I think you'll find that a lot of people here on this conference had exposure to family separations. What I found in my reporting is that anybody who who was involved in this policy in any way really is kind of forever impacted by it, because it was such a profoundly painful experience for the families who were involved. I think I remember all of the separated families that I've spent time with. One who ended up in my story, this father, Nasario Jacinto Carrillo, he was one of the first separated parents I spoke to on the phone who was still in that process of trying to even find his daughter. So they'd been separated for several weeks at that point. He had agreed to his own deportation and signed documentation in English because Border Patrol agents, he says, told him that if he agreed to be deported, that his 5-year-old daughter, Filomena, would be sent back to Guatemala, where he lived, in 2 weeks. You know, he said, I would never have chosen to abandon my daughter, which is, of course, what we heard from the Trump administration in many cases when it became clear that so many parents had been deported without their children. Many of them were blamed for going along with it. So, you know, as a reporter, my job almost every day is calling people up and talking with them about really, really difficult and harrowing experiences. But there's something about being on the phone with a parent who's begging you for information about where their child is, and knowing that their child is in American government custody, but not being able to provide any answers for them, that I think is just an unforgettable experience.
That's a devastating experience. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the historic context here, Caitlin, just to help our audience appreciate how we arrived in this moment. We've had, I hate to say it, but in our country, we've had really extreme and inhumane immigration policies in the past. The Chinese Immigration Act comes to mind. What was different this time? And how did we arrive at the organization of a bureaucracy that led to this kind of cruel indifference? I wonder, as you give us this response, Caitlin, if you might not talk a bit about the origins of the Department of Homeland Security, the transition from its vigilance on global terrorism to becoming so focused on immigration and the implications that's had for public policy. And I hope you might touch a bit on the 2005 Operation Streamline, and how that led to this pathway.
Sure. So when I trace the roots of zero tolerance and family separations, they really lead back to this dramatic shift in the way that the United States began to look at the southern border following 9/11 and following the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, which of course was established by the George W. Bush administration as part of an effort following 9/11 to prevent a future terrorist attack. We do have a very long history with immigration policy and troubling history that goes back even further, to the earliest years of our country. But it's actually notable that we've never in our history separated children from their parents as a means of deterrence until very recently, until the Trump administration. So following 9/11, the way that, again, the federal government looked at crossing the border without authorization changed. Prior to that, the U.S. attorneys stationed along the southern border, individuals who have these large caseloads, often with really important, national security cases, with drugs and weapons trafficking cases, with human trafficking cases, they were not all that concerned about, at the time, mostly single men from Mexico who were crossing the southern border to work in the United States and send money back to their family. Federal judges also on the same page about that, as well as, the government generally, really. But as part of this effort to really try to prevent terrorism and prevent a future attack on American soil, you had this shifting perspective that really swept in migrant labor in a way that doesn't seem to have been useful and doesn't seem to have been successful, according to any research that I've seen. There's really not much of a connection between the two. And yet, DHS is established. The Border Patrol, which is a very old agency, been around since the 1920s, becomes part of it, as does ICE, which does enforcement in the interior of the country. And there's this renewed effort to really try to limit illegal border crossing. That starts out with, as you mentioned, in 2005, Operation Streamline, which was an idea to prosecute, again, individual adults who cross the border illegally. The first time you do it, it's a misdemeanor. And after that, it becomes a felony as a way to discourage migration. And even though from the very beginning, there were all kinds of reasons to question this approach to trying to limit border crossing, so many things, courts became completely overwhelmed. These U.S. attorneys who have really important cases to focus on started to say, hey, I'm not able to actually focus on these more serious crimes because I've got so many misdemeanors in front of me. But I think more importantly, right, it's been shown over and over again that these prosecutions are not by any stretch, the most effective way to address flows across the southern border. Again and again, researchers have found, it's economics, it's public safety, both in the United States and in countries people are fleeing from, that are the primary indicators of what the numbers of people crossing the border any given year are going to look like.
I want you to pause on that last point. There's reams of data and evidence that makes it clear that these deterrence efforts really are not preventative. But you just touched on something really important that I think is central to how we think about foreign policy in the U.S. as it relates to Western Hemisphere. What is it that caused the consequential surge that we had at the border from 2014 right up until this period of the family separations? And what was it that was different this time? Because we had a surge that was not of Mexican migrants, but went beyond that.
That's right. So as migration from Mexico decreased, which again is largely attributed to economic circumstances in Mexico and in the United States, numbers of children and families coming particularly from the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, began to rise really dramatically, initially peaking in the summer of 2014, which presented great challenges for the Obama administration at the time. And of course, they've risen again and again since then. Those changes, those fluctuations in migration are again, primarily attributable to the circumstances in the Northern Triangle countries. Deep poverty is very common, as is a great deal of instability, the daily concern of living in fear of gang violence, a feeling like you can't go to the government or authorities there and expect for crimes to be actually prosecuted. There's a lot of corruption and destabilization. I've spent a fair amount of time reporting on these regions and even visited. And, it's hard, I think, sometimes for an American audience to really understand why someone might make this journey, especially with a young child. And when you've actually visited the regions where people are coming from, you can see that it's done out of necessity. It's not something that people sign up for by choice. It's because they feel that their children have no other opportunity, and they frankly fear in a lot of cases that their children might not survive to grow up and lead healthy lives. And that's what leads people to come to the United States.
So now, Caitlin, I'm going to fast forward a bit and get right to the intersection of politics and public policy. We all remember, of course, that immigration and the wall was a central feature of Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. Steve Bannon, Roger Stone were principal architects of the rhetoric around the wall and immigration policy. But there was another person, Stephen Miller, who was a speechwriter for Donald Trump, who was given outsized credit for the narrative that led to the success of Trump in the primary and then in the general election in 2016. In your story, you make it very, very clear that the kind of hagiography around Stephen Miller inside of the White House helped him to kind of catapult above his station in the White House and to influence policy and to, in effect, bully cabinet officers and compel them to take up this family separation policy. I want you to kind of talk about that, but before you get to Stephen Miller, I hope you'll first start with Tom Homan, who I understand is really the principal architect of this initiative. And I want you to just kind of help our viewers appreciate how this was a conversation that first started and originated in the Obama administration, what the reaction was from the then leadership of Department of Homeland Security, and then how this strand was picked up in the future in ways that came directly from the politics of 2016.
So as we've discussed, the use of consequence delivery or prevention by deterrence, which are ways of referring to strategies that include prosecution, post 2005, they become more and more politically popular, I think, for a few reasons, which is why you see them re-implemented during this 2014 surge that we just discussed. I think that administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have really wanted to show outcomes, have wanted to show success in this post 9/11 era at keeping the country safer. And so I think that's part of why consequence delivery and prosecution has been upheld, in numerous congressional hearings, for example, again, in a kind of bipartisan way as a measure of success, even when that really doesn't align with any data or academic support for what's actually influencing flows of migration. So in this 2014 surge, you have a man named Tom Homan, who at that time was a high-ranking deputy at ICE, but had spent decades in immigration law enforcement, going before Jay Johnson, who was the Homeland Security Secretary at the time. Johnson was, faced with this surge of migration, trying to figure out what to do about it. And so he'd called a meeting, asked for his best and brightest minds to prevent ideas. And Tom Homan presents this idea to separate families, to apply the same prosecution consequence that had been used against individual adults to adults who are traveling with children as well. And I think the fact that, sort of it even fell to Homan to come up with a solution to the problem reflects a lack of congressional action. Of course, we know Congress sets the laws with regard to immigration policy, and those laws that we have in place now really don't reflect these geopolitical circumstances that have changed really dramatically and that we're discussing here today. And so again and again, our national response to this issue, which is, of course, ideally something that takes into consideration economic policy, humanitarian policy, national security, all of these issues, it's been left to the Border Patrol and to the immigration enforcement authorities.
So to be clear, you're more than suggesting that congressional inaction leads to action and the empowerment of police officers, basically, at the border. And we also know that there's a history of really inadequate professional training of the officers that have been at the border.
That's right. Because Congress can choose to focus on other issues, other parts of the executive branch, a White House can focus elsewhere. The Border Patrol can't make this problem go away. They're the ones who actually are there every day processing individuals into the United States, a lot of times understaffed, a lot of times extremely overwhelmed and under-resourced. And so they don't have necessarily a choice really, but to come up with solutions. And what they tend to reach for is what is at their disposal. As a law enforcement agency, that means cracking down, that means punishment. So Tom Homan proposes this idea to Jay Johnson, who had used other deterrent strategies in response to migration, but said this one went too far, that it made him uncomfortable. And he says in my story that he had immediately in his mind this vision of a parent and child clinging to each other, and he didn't feel it was necessary or worth it to put families through that. He also didn't think it was worth it to ask Border Patrol agents to have to do that work, which would have been incredibly painful for all involved. And so the idea is shelved until Donald Trump takes office as president. You mentioned Stephen Miller, his chief immigration advisor in the White House, not a particularly high-ranking official at all, but somebody who from day one, and I've done lots of reporting on Stephen Miller's sort of period of research during the transition into, Trump taking office. He looked far and wide for any sort of strategy that could be used to show, the voters and the base of President Trump that the administration was cracking down on the border, securing the border, really just preventing people from crossing the border at any cost. And so one of the ideas that Miller finds out about and that he really latches onto is this idea to separate families. And so he begins to exert pressure from the top, as you mentioned, in a way that completely skirted the chain of authority. He had no authority to be ordering cabinet secretaries and heads of agencies around, but he was doing so anyway because of this insulation he experienced. He was thought to have been responsible for basically getting Trump elected. And so as a result of that, he was able to run right over people. But as you also alluded to, the success ultimately, I say that in quotes, of the implementation of family separation and zero tolerance, that's just as, if not more, I think, attributable to those in the bureaucracy who went along with it. Some of whom today say they never supported the idea, wish they hadn't. But for various reasons, sometimes having to do with personal career ambition, ended up getting behind the White House and agreeing to go along with and even pushing for the separation of families.
I really want to sit in that and lift up this notion. It recalls Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, where we see a group of ambitious careerists and indifferent bureaucrats advancing some of the most repressive policies that we've had. I want you to focus a bit on John Kelly, who went from the Department of Home, who once was a leader at the border, leader on enforcement, went to Department of Homeland Security as its principal executive, and then moved to the White House as chief of staff. We need to focus on him. And on Kirstjen Nielsen, who resisted this policy for some time before eventually caving into it. If you could talk about them, the ancillary officials around them, and how we ended up with denials, obfuscations, and then clarity that we were indeed, as a nation, conducting this reprehensible policy.
So starting with John Kelly, he's one of many people I interviewed who has a complicated story that explains how and why they tried to, or say they tried to, prevent family separations from taking place. That you can understand the logic of it, and it also, at the end of the day, wasn't successful. I mean, what I didn't hear from Kelly or really anybody else at any high level in the administration was that they tried just jumping up and down and saying, no, I don't want to do this. I think it's unethical. I think it's evil. I mean, you didn't hear the kinds of arguments that people were making to me after the fact. They weren't, as far as I can tell, presented in any high-level venue. So, as you mentioned, General Kelly, prior to joining the Trump administration, was our nation's highest-ranking law enforcement official, overseeing in part the Northern Triangle countries. And so he'd seen this migration surge firsthand in 2014 and actually met with, at the time, Secretary Jay Johnson to talk about how to address it. He was not a big believer in deterrence because he understood the factors that were pushing people to the United States, the great deal of destabilization, the lack of opportunity, concerns about public safety, as well as the power of remittances that were coming from the United States to Central America. And so he told Johnson in 2014, he didn't think deterrence was the way out of the surge that the United States was facing at the time. And he felt really the same way, he says, when he joined the Trump administration. When this idea to separate families is proposed to him, he told me that he immediately said he thought it was a bad idea. Again, didn't think it was going to be successful, but also says he found it to be immoral. But he pursued this approach of focusing on the logistical inadequacies, the fact that the government just simply wasn't ready, didn't have the shelters, didn't have the detention facilities, hadn't done the training, didn't have the staffing to be able to do this effectively or efficiently in any kind of way. And so he really focused on that for a year and a half, he says, as what he thought was the best way to prevent family separations from happening. This approach was also adopted by Kirstjen Nielsen, who started out in the administration as Kelly's chief of staff at DHS. She followed Kelly to the White House and then, of course, became Homeland Security Secretary herself. Again, somebody who'd served in DHS under the George W. Bush administration. She's a cybersecurity expert, not an immigration wonk, or somebody who had really strong views on immigration one way or the other.
And to be clear, Caitlin, this is somebody who was taking over the leadership of an agency that I believe has 250,000 personnel and had never run anything close to a major organization before.
That's right. And I think that, there's a lot to learn from Kirstjen Nielsen's role as DHS secretary and the experience that she had. I mentioned in the story at some point that there were lots of people throughout the Trump administration who ended up in positions much higher than they would have under a traditional administration, because
I think you called it the C team.
Because there were so many people who didn't want to work for President Trump, that you have people, installed 1 or 2 or 3 rungs higher than they would have otherwise been in the government. And that actually becomes really significant when it comes to her making this decision. For example, Kirstjen Nielsen was viewed very skeptically by a lot of her staff, who made the same point you did, that, prior to joining this administration, she'd run a consulting firm with a few employees, didn't have a lot of leadership experience, though she was an expert in cybersecurity. And so to take over an agency with 250,000 workers was a huge leap. And so she had a lot to prove, and I think faced some internal pressure probably to, show people that she actually was, qualified for the job, and also had a lot to prove in that she was viewed as a moderate, was viewed skeptically. And as I'm sure moderates in this administration were basically viewed as, secret liberals who had to constantly kind of prove how tough and strong they were and their conservative values in order to be able to survive another day. And so I think these pressures really bore down on Nielsen. But it's not pressure alone that leads her to ultimately sign off on zero tolerance. It's also a lot of inaccurate information, which again, from an accountability perspective, I think is so important for people to understand. Partisanship aside, a Homeland Security Secretary should not be presented with an idea, and that's supported based on information that's inaccurate. And, in some cases, I think it was sort of willfully inaccurate. I think in other cases, it was just a bit of laziness. And, all these other people who were supposed to be giving Nielsen advice were facing pressure themselves from the White House to push forward with this idea. So they skipped some steps, didn't cross really any of their T's or dot their I's. And so again, there is pressure that plays a role, but there's also just falsehood that I think, is another reason to sort of, have a moment of accountability on how this all came to be.
I think the phrase that you use in the story is a kind of ambient ignorance, which fell over all of the Department of Homeland Security, that extended out to HHS as well.
Well, that's another issue, Patrick, if I may just really briefly. The ambient ignorance, I think, played a huge role here, in that, as many of your viewers may know, just the baseline level of knowledge of our immigration enforcement system in Washington is really lacking. It's not an issue area that people are necessarily clamoring to work on. And you can understand where they're coming from, and that it's this intractable and very controversial often topic, and yet one that very clearly needs the attention of our best and brightest minds, and also needs the attention of, at a baseline level, of a much broader subset of government officials. And so you had lots of people in the Trump administration who sat in meetings about zero tolerance without even realizing that what was being discussed was the separation of families, because they didn't understand, this wasn't rocket science, frankly, but they didn't understand how the immigration system and the immigration enforcement system worked. And so, they had no, and there was also sort of an assumption of, well, we couldn't be talking about, the worst case scenario that I'm reading about in the press, because that just sounds too barbaric. The press must be exaggerating. Those two things combined, such that you had a lot of people, staying quiet in meetings where this is being discussed, and they didn't even fully understand it.
Literally the worst way to make any kind of policy, let alone policy that touches on the lives of thousands and thousands of children. So let me I'm going to ask you a very basic question about competencies, which is, how on earth did we lose these children? How do we fail to adequately track them? I'd understand if we're talking about hundreds of thousands, but we're talking about, several thousand. Just doesn't seem as if it's possible for the United States government, the most sophisticated government we have on the planet, to have lost thousands of children. I hope you can help us understand that. And then I'm going to ask you a question about asylum policy and metering. But first, I want you to just kind of walk us through how on earth the United States lost thousands of children.
It is somewhat beyond comprehension, how in terms of data, a relatively small group, you're talking about between 5,000 and 6,000 children and families were lost to the American government. The answer to that, briefly put, is just that no planning took place in advance of the implementation of this policy. Part of that has to do with the fact that the Health and Human Services Department, which takes custody of children being held by the American federal government, was not informed in advance that zero tolerance was going to come into place in any meaningful way. And that's really significant. And I talk about in the story how Alex Azar, who was the Health and Human Services secretary at the time, didn't know about immigration, as we've discussed, and really didn't bother to get up to speed on his agency's role. So it's likely that there were meetings, Azar was present for, where zero tolerance may have been discussed, and really it flew right over his head. But I think that if HHS had been brought into the conversation, certainly you would have heard that, this agency doesn't have a computer system that speaks to that of DHS, and there will be no way to figure out when a child shows up at a shelter overseen by HHS who or where their parent is. Beyond that, there, of course, was not a system for reunifying those families, because HHS was used to housing unaccompanied minors who in the past were only separated from the adults with whom they crossed the border if those adults were thought of as a threat. So the system is in a way set up to, keep kids away from the adult they cross the border with if they happen to be separated, which happened in far, far smaller numbers prior to Trump coming into office. But there were people raising red flags, even within the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Division of the Department of Homeland Security, a division that ends up sort of similar to HHS being left out of the room a lot when it comes to talking about law enforcement ideas, because they're the ones often raising red flags and pushing on the brakes, talking about how, an enforcement policy might have negative repercussions for the people targeted by it, or people who become casualties of it. They were collecting complaints from separated parents and families for months and compiling reports that were very specific in terms of delineating not only, what will happen if we continue to separate families and do so on a large scale, but making very clear recommendations. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they have an online database where you can look up an adult in the immigration detention system. They proposed expanding that to include children as well. That's one of several recommendations they came up with that just seem to have been honestly completely ignored, such that there was no plan in place. And that's how you have children and families getting lost.
It's hard to tell how much of this is a question of basic competency and how much is intentional cruelty, with this notion somehow that cruelty is going to lead to a kind of radical deterrence. I want, if I can, just talk about this question of asylum seekers. Caitlin, can you help us all understand exactly what was happening with the criminal prosecution of asylum seekers, which conflicts with international legal standards? Your report makes it really clear that the zero tolerance policy was happening at the exact same time that the Trump administration was limiting access to ports of entry for asylum seekers using metering. Can you help us understand metering and what that actually means for policies as we go forward? I'm thinking here of what occurred during COVID with the use of Title 42. Can you just kind of draw the dotted line for us from there to now?
Yes, one of the arguments you heard most frequently from the Trump administration once zero tolerance was announced publicly and they started to face backlash from both Democrats and Republicans was that the administration didn't want to have to prosecute any adult traveling with a child. And if only those families would present themselves at legal ports of entry and request asylum, the quote unquote right way, that they would have been either granted entry into the United States or at the very least given, a legal due process. But that did not acknowledge this reality of metering that you raised. It's a practice that began, I believe, in the Obama administration, but expanded again dramatically under President Trump, kind of commensurate to the growth in border crossings. It's a way of limiting the number of people who can present themselves at legal ports of entry on a daily basis. And so you had people, even prior to Remain in Mexico, which some of our viewers here might be familiar with, you had people living at the ends of these bridges in Mexico waiting to get entry to the United States for weeks or even months. And these are not safe places to be, sitting ducks, so to speak, as, a parent with a young child. I've seen in my reporting in those areas, kids getting heat stroke. And of course, crime can be rampant depending on which community you're talking about, things like theft and kidnapping. And so you had a situation where, the families given the choice between living outside for weeks or months at a time in danger, both, danger of violence and also just living outside in the elements and all that comes with it, or simply crossing the border between ports of entry and seeking out Border Patrol agents to proactively request asylum, which is what you most often saw during this era that we're discussing. It wasn't people trying to sneak by, and sneak into the country undetected, but approaching Border Patrol agents of their own volition and saying, I'd like to request protection in the United States. You also, frankly, had coyotes, smugglers who work in northern Mexico and bring families across, who figured out what was going on with regard to metering. And so they were dropping families off, in the middle of the desert in between ports of entry, because they knew how the system worked. And so a lot of times family didn't necessarily know, what they were getting into, where they were going to be left off. They have a smuggler who's told them, this is the process, this is what you should do, without even knowing, that the administration was supposedly encouraging them to present themselves at legal ports of entry instead, but again, not always granting access to those ports. And so that, that crossing between ports of entry, though, became a pretense for the criminal charging of parents who cross the border with their children. And a lot of times you hear this argument that, we're a law enforcement agency, we have to enforce the laws. And what they're referring to, in defense of zero tolerance, when you're making those comments are, these statutes 1325 and 1326 that make border crossing without authorization illegal. But as you pointed out, Patrick, there are also domestic and international laws that guarantee the legal right to access asylum the asylum system in the United States. And when those are violated, again, I think just as valid as the other set of laws in reference here, you don't hear as much complaining from, or you sort of hear complaining from opposite sides. In reality, again, just to go back to Congress, and I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but you have these laws which actually seem to conflict with one another, which is leaving the Border Patrol to figure out how to deal with it. And we've seen again and again how they choose to do so.
So let's talk about oversight and accountability, Caitlin, and implications for future policy work here. I'm going to do that by first kind of bringing in a question from the audience. But as I take up this question, I'm hoping I can get you to kind of fast forward to talk about current DOJ versus DHS finger pointing on accountability on this issue. So Claudia Montesino says, thanks for this incredible discussion. It seems to me that the role of the former AG, Jeff Sessions, has not been addressed. He was a major player on this horrific policy, even saying, quote, we need to take away children, no matter how young. Why cannot he and others behind this policy be prosecuted for this now when several children still haven't been reunited with their families? Can you do a couple of things for us here, Caitlin? Help us understand what the number of children that are still not reunited, the numbers that are outstanding, the actions that have been taken up by the Biden administration. Touch on Jeff Sessions' role and whether or not it was legal, illegal, as implied by the questioner, but also help our viewers to understand what you've discovered in your interrogation of the current Secretary of Homeland Security on this question of accountability, and what we've learned about the DOJ, the current DOJ's posture on this case.
I'll try to get to all those different points, all of which are really important. At the outset, we have an immigration system that involves the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and also, as we've discussed today, the Health and Human Services Department. And whether you're covering immigration, whether you're working on this issue on the Hill, that the sort of finger pointing between these agencies is one of the most consistent facets of your work, and it's completely pointless and it's frustrating, and it really hinders accountability when it comes to family separation and frankly lots of other issues related to immigration, because you go and ask DHS for answers and they say, well, talk to DOJ, this is their fault, and DOJ says, well, talk to HHS, and you go around in this circle that actually prevents any sort of forward movement. I heard it again and again in my reporting of this story, and it speaks to a system that isn't working. You asked how many kids remain separated today. The official number is between 700 and 1,000. But some of those families are thought to have probably found each other independently and not reported it back to the US government. I don't want to say most, because it really is an open question, partly because, again, record keeping was just so bad that we don't, even to this day, have a very firm number of exactly how many families were separated. And you have over 150 children whose parents to this day still have not been located by the federal government, even though President Biden, soon after taking office, signed an executive order establishing this family reunification task force to continue the work of reunifying as many separated families as possible. I have heard they're making great progress. I mean, the numbers reflect it, but my reporting also shows there's a lot of intentionality there behind trying to reunite these families. I will say, as time goes on, the number of remaining separated families may shrink, but the challenge in a way grows, because you're talking about parents who at this point have been separated for years. Many of whom, ended up back in rural communities where they may not have access to the same phone number they did before, if they had a phone before. If they have a phone now, it can be very hard to track people down when they've been sent back to the kinds of situations of deep poverty and rural isolation that we've been discussing. You also have parents, separated parents I've talked to who were deported and who are living in hiding because the same threat that existed, which led them to come to the United States, is still there. And so they've, moved to a different city, or they're living in a shelter, in hiding from whatever that threat may be. Jeff Sessions, without a doubt, has made a career of, supporting very hawkish and harsh implementation of immigration laws, really believes in, again, enforcing a specific subset of laws. It's not all the laws, but it's the ones that speak to enforcement with no room for humanitarian exception, no room for gray. And so he did push for the separation of families. Part of his motivation there was also trying to get back into the good graces of President Trump, who was upset with him for pulling out of basically involvement in investigating whether the Trump campaign had colluded with the Russian government or Russian operatives. Basically wanted to get back into the good graces of the president. But Sessions actually didn't have a deep and detailed understanding of this policy. Which again, it is not to absolve him of responsibility, but it speaks to how many people were in the room having this discussion about zero tolerance without fully understanding what they were talking about. I do want to point out that I heard again and again in my interviews almost this argument like Sessions made me do it. Sessions pressured me. Sessions kept bringing this up in meetings. I felt like I had to. There's nothing legally that the DOJ did or can do to require Border Patrol agents to refer parents traveling with children for prosecution. It doesn't make sense. They're entirely separate federal agencies, and Jeff Sessions cannot order Border Patrol agents to do anything, frankly. And so to put all the blame on him for what happened, I think is doing a disservice again to this necessary accountability that needs to take place. And then similarly, the finger pointing toward HHS that I heard, again and again in my reporting, where people would say, well, HHS lost track of the kids. And it's really a disingenuous argument, because HHS wasn't brought into the conversation in advance of zero tolerance being introduced. But, it's also just the case that if the Border Patrol had provided data on who each parent was, that belonged to each child delivered to HHS, reunification would have been enabled in a way that it wasn't. When I asked, just lastly here, to get to your final point, when I asked Secretary Mayorkas, our current DHS secretary, about accountability for those individuals who are responsible for family separations, who pushed for it or stood by, he said that responsibility fell to the DOJ. But in fact, our current DOJ has been defending this practice in lawsuits brought by separated families, in a lot of cases making the same arguments that you heard Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen during zero tolerance make, are arguments that are not genuine and that are just simply not true. That a family separation policy didn't exist, I think, is so clearly refuted by documentary evidence from before, during, and after zero tolerance, that continuing to make this argument, it's really hard to understand because it's just simply not true. And
it's a continued tyranny of the bureaucrats. And I wonder, Caitlin, given that we're at time, if you can take that one point and really address this question of congressional oversight that's coming up over and over and over again from our viewers in their questions. At some point, Paul Ryan said, as noted in your story, that if Republicans didn't work to pass a law banning family separation at the border, he feared Republicans would lose the 2018 midterm elections. Clearly, that did not happen then. We now have Democrats who are in the majority in Congress, the Senate, a Democratic president who ran against this policy in the White House. Is there any stirring, based on your reporting, around congressional action that can and should be taken now to prevent this from the future? And are there things that you believe that reside in the executive authority of the president to do in lieu of congressional action here?
I think there are measures that both Congress and the White House could take here. Obviously, Congress has much more leeway to be able to definitively and sort of permanently prevent something like this from ever happening again. If you look back at executive actions like DACA, which is of course well known to many of your viewers, introduced under President Obama, and policies like that come from the executive branch become really political footballs, and they're not lasting. There's nothing stopping a subsequent administration from simply changing course and getting rid of it. Nothing is a bit of an exaggeration in that the Trump administration tried to get rid of DACA and faced legal challenges, but it's certainly not as secure as a law. And I actually think that there have been, to answer you, some members of Congress sort of stirring for, a law explicitly banning, the use of family separations as a deterrent strategy. I don't know that I've seen momentum behind, those few people who've spoken up in support of this idea. I think that, immigration, as I write in the piece, it tends to fall off of, platforms and fall off of priority lists because people think of it as a no-win situation, a way to sort of alienate lots of people. But what I found in covering family separations as they were playing out, and again with this story, is that really there's a lot of bipartisan consensus around the idea that separating families is beyond the pale, is not something that aligns with our nation's values, nonpartisan values. And so I don't think that it's a terribly controversial issue, but I think it is still lacking in momentum and lacking in support and enthusiasm. And again, a critical mass of our best and brightest minds working to try to make it happen. And so, one wonders why, given, the fact that, as you said, even Paul Ryan, the Republican Speaker of the House, right at the end of Zero Tolerance, talked about how this was an incredibly important issue to congressional Republicans. I think part of what happened is people are overwhelmed. There's been a lot of news between then and now, and it was easy to forget, which is part of why we wanted to do this story, because it's a moment in United States history and frankly, one that's still playing out, but that, we didn't at The Atlantic think that Americans should forget about.
That's a perfect note to end on, this notion of bipartisan consensus around values, to challenge that exists, the opportunity to make this right into the future. I want to commend you, Caitlin, for this extraordinary journalism, commend The Atlantic as well. I recommend this story to anyone who cares, not just about immigration policy, but fundamental questions about what it means to build an inclusive society and to stand up the right kind of scaffolding around our democracy. Thank you for this conversation, Caitlin, and for your work.
Thank you, Patrick. It was an honor to be here.
Sure.